So glad to have you joining us once again for Curiosity Not Judgment. Welcome. My name is Birga.
And I'm Gary.
So last week I had an opportunity to sit down with my daughter and talk a little bit about technology and the impact on her generation and the impact that that generation is then making in the marketplace, in the workforce, as they are very tech consumed. And so I was thinking that I wanted to cover with Gary today kind of the other side of this topic about how do we make a decision, whether as leaders in our home or in our workplace, about when it's time to adopt new technology, and are we ready for the windfall of change that inevitably happens when there's some marked new device or software, so new something that comes in. Are we ready for what happens when we introduce that? And so wanted to discuss that. And does anything immediately come to mind from your experiences about a new element that got introduced at a workplace that really changed the dynamic?
Sure. I mean, we can talk about everything from the fax machine to the, but let's go back to the Gutenberg printer. So we had books being written by hand forever, which kept books out of the hands of most people in the world up until the Gutenberg press. And then when you had further advances and you started having books published, and then newspapers, and communication just took and information took a big turn. And since then, one could argue that the rate of change has accelerated and is still accelerating. However, there are moments in time that you can mark by an era. Yeah. You've got the era of the radio. That was followed by the era of the television, which is followed by the era of the computer, and then the cell phone, and then the smartphone. Some people skip over the fact that there were cell phones for a long time before there were smartphones. And there's a famous author, Tony Seba, who does some really good work in this, and he talks about an S curve. Now, the bell curve says you've got early adopters. I'll do it this way for the camera. You've got early adopters, and then you've got the majority of people that buy it, and then the rate of change of the acceleration dips over, and then you have the laggards, the last people to buy things. There's people who still don't have smartphones. Tony Seba talks about the front part of the bell curve, which is called the S curve, which is, okay, you got a couple of units sold, and then all of a sudden tipping point and millions sell. Okay, and the cell phone, so it's a classic example of how business and consultants and predictors got it wrong. People thought that cell phones would be, when they were finally implemented, would have a curve that was kind of nice and easy, and it would take a long time because of expense and other things. Well, the cell phone took off 1,000 times faster than everybody expected. And now we talk about, let's take the current market of EVs.
Define it.
Electric vehicles. And, I own an electric vehicle. There's some people who've owned electric vehicles now for 10 years.
Right.
But the majority, I think the total penetration, depending on who you listen to, is somewhere between 3 and 5%. But by 2030, there are states like California, I think by 2035, you may not buy an internal combustion engine.
You can't buy, or they can't manufacture?
Cannot buy one in the state of California.
Wow.
So therefore, and then 10, I think it's now 12 states have immediately followed that. And so you cannot. So government regulation can come in and help with these S curves, as Tony Seba defines. But by and large, you have these tipping points where things go viral, would be the YouTube reference, and everybody needs one, right? So I think what you're asking is a really important question. How do we decide when some new technology enters our home? How do we decide when it comes into your workplace? And how do you decide how you are going to interact with it in your life? Is this going to be a passing fad? Don't pay attention to it. Or is this going to be something significant? And when should we train ourselves?
Right. Well, and, I suppose this involves a little bit of fortune telling, right? You had those that I'm sure poo-pooed the idea that cell phones would ever take off, and you can go down the list of technologies that have become commonplace, that I'm sure there was some group of the populace that did not believe that it was ever going to make a mark on society.
Yes.
And so, yes, there is a small degree of fortune telling in this. But, okay, going to your electric vehicle statement about how there's now laws or regulations on the books saying that you cannot buy traditional motor engines after the year 2030. That spurs all kinds of thoughts in my head, but it's going to utterly change industry in so many different areas. Everything from thinking about parking spaces in public settings to parking spaces in hotels to
or your garage.
Yeah, in your personal garage, and then just the whole auto industry period. What happens to all the used car dealers? Does everybody just go out of business January 1st of 2030?
Well, we've had things like this before, like lead. We went to, taking lead out of gasoline. So we went to unleaded vehicles. There were still leaded vehicles around. I still have a 1953 MGTD, and I have to add lead. I have to go to the auto parts store and buy lead and add it to my unleaded gasoline to have it run, because it's a little bit of lubricant in the cylinders. Okay. The engines are designed differently now, so it doesn't just there's not a mark in time where you have to throw all your old cars away. It's just we will not sell new ones anymore.
New ones. Okay.
So this happens throughout history, but you bring up a couple of really good points, and that is, so number one, it's one thing to have a goal. It's quite a different thing to have a plan.
Right.
We have a goal. They have a goal of no, and they're saying it's a mandate of no more cars, no more internal combustion engine cars being sold in California by 2035. However, the day after they said that, CAISO, which manages their energy markets, said, please don't charge your EVs today because we're having a crisis in energy. Now, people are going to assume that we're going to change the infrastructure to be ready for all EVs by then, but I can tell you that doesn't exist now. And who's going to pay for that? And are we going to put up with higher electrical rates, which everybody says, no, you can't touch my electrical rates. But the fact of the matter is there is not a neighborhood in the country today that can handle one EV per home, let alone two. So what are we going to do? What are we going to do with all the transformers that are currently out there? And transformers are one of those things that it's very hard to get. Are we going to double the transformers? Are we going to work on distributed storage within the neighborhoods? What are those things? One of the other things that is a saying I like to say is, it's easy to predict the future. You said crystal ball earlier, as long as you keep a keen eye on the inevitable. All right, well, what's inevitable? If every state in the union mandates EVs by 2030, 2035, well, guess what's inevitable? EVs. So it would behoove those of us who are watching the future, and I'm one of them, to say, what is the infrastructure needed for that result?
Right. You're
mandating an outcome which has an effect on the system. What things have to happen between now and then to be ready for that mandate? And let's start working on those now.
So I want to scale back many layers here, or many levels, and go back to the home. And let's stay on the same topic of electric vehicles. And I'm not even worried about right now the charger in the garage, but I'm just talking about the family that's trying to make a decision about adopting a new technology. And so how do you begin to ask some questions? How do you be curious and not have a judgment right out the gate about what it looks like for your family to adopt something? So in this case, electric vehicles, it's not just as simple as buy a Chevy versus a Ford. There's many things to consider. So talk a little bit about that.
Well, first of all, it's like the decision of what to bring into your house for anything, whether it's a dog, not new technology at all.
Nope.
They've been around for a while, or anything. And that is, first of all, do I need this or do I want this? At Intel, when we started doing factory automation, that we had such a push towards automation. At one point, some of us engineers and engineering managers were saying, are we just doing automation for automation's sake? Does it actually make sense to automate this process? Sometimes it did, sometimes it did not.
Yeah.
If you have to have 0.2 seconds in an acid bath for a lot of wafers makes sense, well, maybe a robotic arm makes sense for that. But there's many things that it really was up to watching a process and seeing something happen, and it took some intervention by an operator where it did not make sense. And does it make sense to come up with a sophisticated robot to move a lot of wafers from this location to another location 5 meters away, or is it better just to pick it up and move it yourself?
Right.
So I think it's really important to say, okay, do I need this or do I want this? If I actually need it, that's a different decision-making process. How do we adapt the family to incorporate this technology or this thing, this dog, into our house? If it's a matter of just want, okay, you want this, what's the consequences? What's the consequences to our budget? What's the consequences to the way people live their lives in the house and the quality of life in the house? What's the consequences to the way we're making decisions? What's the consequences if we want to leave town? What do we have to do?
Yep.
Right? And I'm thinking about a dog as I'm saying this now, but any technology is true.
Well, I think that same leaving town with an electric vehicle is a valid question, right?
No question.
I mean, if you want to go from here being Albuquerque, New Mexico to San Diego, you better know where your charging stations are along the way or you're not going to make it.
The range anxiety is a real thing. There are some times when I take my wife's car, when we take our wife's car, like for instance, we decided to go to Santa Fe the other day and then Ojo Caliente. For those of you listening who are outside of New Mexico, you would know, or I should tell you that it's an hour drive to Santa Fe, and I can go to Santa Fe and back on one charge.
In your electric vehicle?
In my electric vehicle. But if I want to go then to Ojo Caliente, which is another hour north, where there are no charging stations because it's in the middle of nowhere, it's hot springs, hot baths, then I'm not going to take that vehicle.
Sure.
We're taking my wife's hybrid car.
There you go.
That you can use gas in, and so that's the point. Is what are the consequences on the other things that we're doing? How many chargers do we have to buy, even if it's a new iPhone, right? With a different charging, for instance, a Lightning versus the old,
crazy.
USB, whatever. What different things have to happen? Now, it's funny how little we actually think about these kinds of things before we run out and buy the new thing, or download that thing on our phone.
Right.
Now, it's less of an issue now, but you used to have to really make a decision about whether you wanted a new app on the phone because it could cause memory issues.
Right. You're going to use up all your storage. Yeah. These are very interesting things to consider, and absolutely, I think we are going to have to get ourselves in the habit of starting to ask some of the questions before we get enchanted by the shiny thing that seems so special in the moment. But yeah, to the point of how are we going to get this thing powered up? How is it going to impact our behaviors? Are you a city commuter versus a long haul, like to do lots of excursions, all of these considerations that have to take place. But there's going to be a time, conceivably, from where we're looking now, there's going to be a time when some of these decisions are forced upon us. And so those, according to the bell curve, right, those are the laggards. So how do you get from here to there to not be the one kicking and screaming at the very end and then maybe having to incur tremendous amount of cost to retrofit your home, your situation, in order to receive the now mandated form of vehicle?
If you study change management, and Bridges, Bill Bridges wrote a great book back in the 80s that we used to use at Intel even, on managing change. Managing transition is what they called it at the time, which is just another fancy word for change. And if you plot it out, like anything, you've got a bell curve, but you've got laggards. Those laggards are not a bad thing. They're just different. It's like introvert and extrovert. There are some people that will change to a new system of doing something by the end of the paragraph that you're speaking currently. And there's others that take a little bit more convincing, and others that just won't do it. They just can't physically wrap their mind around it until they've had some time to think about it and see if it's good for them. There's nothing wrong with any of those approaches. It's very helpful to know that those kinds of folks all exist. Sometimes in the same organization, sometimes in the same family.
Yep.
So if you're one of those people, and I resemble that remark, I'm a bright, shiny object, I'm gonna bring it in the house and we'll figure it out. But it's very important to understand that there's other people in the house that may not.
Right.
Sometimes you can have your own thing and do your own thing. I've got my Apple Watch. Nobody else in the house needs to have an Apple Watch. But if I want to communicate by one Apple Watch to another, or share my fitness tracking or whatever, then you have to go buy one. Or if we want to compare notes on something else. So understanding who the people are in your organization or in your family and how they deal with change and how they deal with change of different things.
Yep.
You may be the first person to go out and buy a new television when we went from tube TVs to flat screens, and I was one of those. But you may not be the first one to jump on this first SpaceX that's going to run around and orbit the Earth.
All right, different levels of risk.
You could, yes, and different levels of interest.
Sure.
There's a matrix here, but risk is one of the components. But levels of interest. You may not have any interest in flying at all, let alone into space.
Yeah.
Right? And so, it may be in levels of autonomous vehicles. It may make you very nervous. When I tell people there will be a time in your lifetime when it will be illegal to drive your own car. And you may have a steering wheel in your trunk like a spare tire. Because once we figure out as a society that autonomous vehicles have less accidents, they'll still occur and they'll make the news.
Yeah.
But much less, probably, I will predict at least a 2/3 reduction in accidents. I think it'll be much higher. Well, then guess what? We're going to start having rules that you can't drive your car. And if I'm an old hot rod driver, I'm going to be not happy about that.
Absolutely.
Even though I'm an early adopter of other things, I have sports cars.
Sure.
So who knows, right?
Well, so if we're thinking about the work environment and your company, your division, whatever, is being forced into change, whether it be a decision that was made at a higher level or simply because whatever you were accustomed to is no longer available, how do we have a genuine sense of curiosity around this new thing and how it's going to impact our work and our relationship with one another? How do we posture ourselves in a healthy manner so that we're not that rigid, furious person like, they've taken all my familiar things away. How do we get out of that trap?
I was around when we said there was no more smoking in the office area at Intel, as an example. Or we're all changing to a different ERP system, a software management business system. And this is why we started studying Bill Bridges, and this will be loosely based on that. But basically, in my experience, you can't just say, hey, we're thinking about going and doing this and start doing it. It's almost like, look, we've decided as a company to do this. The change is mandatory. However, how we accomplish that change is up to you. In my experience, that's the best way to do it. We say, okay, look, here's what the change is, here's what it involves, here's the consequences of those change, both good and bad. Now, and especially if you're one of the laggards, you get to be on the team that figures out how we do this change, over what time period, in what increment, and how we communicate and train the change. That involves the folks in the process of the change, even though the change is mandatory. Because in my experience, and I think a lot of people's experience, a lot of people would say they've seen this, is that if you don't make the change mandatory, you will have people who will say, well, if it's not mandatory, I'm never going to do it.
And those are the ones still using their typewriters, huh?
And who don't have a smartphone.
Right.
Or a cell phone. And that's okay for a personal choice. But if you're in an organization that depends on everybody using the same modes of communication, the same modes of decision making, the same modes of logging financial or engineering data, well, there's no choice to that. I mean, part of an orientation these days of a company is here's the automation we use, and here's how you do it.
Yeah. Oh, I can think about so many scenarios where this is applicable, and we certainly don't have time to dig into them all. But let's just real briefly wrap up with the family application, because not everyone is working or not everyone's in a workplace that has these types of issues. But if there is an adaptation that has to be made in the family setting, would you suggest that same type of dynamic, like just as the heads of the household say, this is the decision we're going to make, and family members, you get to determine how we're implementing? Or is it a very different approach when you're talking about at home?
Something that my wife and I accidentally fell into was the concept of a family meeting. And it started when we were going to move the entire family to Ireland. So this is not a small choice.
No, it's
this
not.
isn't, hey, mom and dad have decided we're going to buy a new house and it's no longer in Corrales,
Yeah.
it's in the Northeast Heights.
Yeah.
This is, we're going to move you out of the country.
Yeah, that's
So,
big.
so this isn't even just another city. This is, okay, you're leaving all your friends and we're moving. And we had made the decision, and so we started having family meetings along the lines. I don't think I knew the Bill Bridges stuff, or if I had, I was using it either accidentally or unintentionally, but saying, we pretty much said, look, let's have a family meeting about this subject. And at first, I think we started off by saying the two older children, the youngest one was going to enter kindergarten. The oldest one was going to enter high school. The middle one was going to be junior high. And I think at first we said, let's offer them a veto. If you could do a compelling reason why the family can't do this, then you throw a veto and we'll talk about it. Luckily, no one did, because I don't know what I would have done with that at the time. The youngest one, though, didn't have a veto. She was too young.
Yeah.
She was just going to go no matter what. We'd throw her on a piece of luggage. She was small. Right? So, but then we started transitioning to, okay, how are we going to do this? What's important? How do we communicate this to the other family members? How do we communicate this to in-laws? How do we communicate this to cousins? How do we transition schools? It turns out that we were able to negotiate stuff that we could bring on the plane with extra luggage allowances, stuff that got to go on a fast flight that we needed right away, and stuff that we could tolerate going on a slow boat, which wasn't going to take several weeks. And so going through that process, the children started becoming involved in the decision, and okay, well, let's plan this, let's plan this, let's plan this. And that helped a huge amount with the transition.
So some very good things to consider. And as always, we love your feedback. So maybe this has spurred some thoughts around a hard change that has to happen in your own home or your work environment. We'd love to hear from you. How's it going? What are some of the tools and the tricks that you're using and implementing among the people that you care for? We'd very much like to hear those. So check in with us at curiositynotjudgment.com. Of course, we've got a Facebook page, and you're welcome to leave comments on any of the platforms where you watch this. And until next time, we will encourage you to stay curious.
Take care. Bye-bye.